Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our Quick Publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
Hello listeners, I'm Chatra and welcome to another episode of Money Talks. And I'm delighted to welcome back a chap that we've had on in the past, somebody that covers the sport of business and the business of sports in a level of detail and has over a long period of time in a way that very few do. Also somebody that has written extensively about the subject for a variety of outlets, including the Mail and Sunday. It is the wonderful Nick Harris. Nick, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. It's a beautiful spring day, and that's always good, the weather being so nice.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, certainly can help put a smile on one's face for sure. But yes, it is coming right towards the start of a new week that follows on from perhaps the most newsworthy week when it comes to the business of football that we've had since perhaps a year ago when the Super League story broke, and that caused a huge furore in certain quarters. So there is so much to cover, but let's start with the story broken by Tariq Panda of the New York Times last week, who wrote about how UEFA are all set to ditch their current set of financial fair play rules and replace them with a new set of rules which are to be based on a certain percentage, which is 70%, whereby clubs need to ensure that their spend on player wages, on transfer fees, agents' fees, amount to ostensibly 70% of a club's overall revenue. And obviously there are other rules that Tariq reported on that would sit alongside that as well. But just reflecting back on the financial fair play rules that did come into effect a number of years ago now, and obviously you've covered these rules in terms of both development, implementation, and effectiveness since they were introduced over a long period of time. So let's just look at that then. So I mean, though the rules have clearly done some good, their planned demise surely has to be seen as a victory for the clubs and owners who were most fundamentally opposed to them, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there's obviously been lots of controversy over the years about the rules. Some clubs are obviously very unhappy with them, when they've fallen foul of them and had punishments. Two particularly prominent clubs in PSG and Man City among them. The rules, as we know, were introduced back they came into operation in 2011-12 season. And, the overall reason for coming in the first place was really to sort of protect clubs from themselves in terms of trying to stem some of the heavy losses that was being seen across UEFA's whole 55 footballing nations. I think there's often a perception to be insular in any country, in England, in Italy, in France, to see things as if these rules were just brought in to get us or to affect our country, which is obviously palpable nonsense. The rules were built in, designed principally to, as I say, try and cut some of the losses, which were particularly bad in the poorer countries. And by and large, they did achieve that, sort of cutting losses by billions of pounds. But all rules have unintended consequences. And maybe once the initial job had been done, that you needed to look at something else to tackle some of the other issues, not least inequality of wealth or level the playing field in terms of actual fairness on the pitch. And So the new system is going to do away with the old FFP, which obviously capped losses at a specific amount, and is now going to be related to relative spending. As you said, 70% of income can in the future be spent on wages plus amortization, which is effectively the amount that you're spending on buying players annually. It won't be 70% from the beginning. It'll be 70% by 2024, few years of bedding in period. But until it actually gets started and we see what effect it has and we see whether it's properly policed, then we can't really judge whether or not it will be successful. Obviously, the original main FFP ended up with Manchester City being handed a 2-year ban for infringements, which was then overturned successfully by Man City in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Now, that case, as we all know, had its controversies. If you're a Manchester City fan, you'll see that as complete vindication that you've never done anything wrong. You've been vindicated. The €10 million fine for not complying is an irrelevance, and the whole process was a nonsense. The counter argument to that, and it's a completely legitimate argument for Man City fans to argue that, because ultimately they've got the ban overturned, albeit with the fine. The counter argument to that is that UEFA, for whatever reason, chose not to demand more information from City, drag the process out. They chose not to follow up the case when it appears that a City executive had contradicted himself in the court proceedings. So, it was becoming messy. It was becoming expensive. The new system, it was imperfectly policed as well, the old system. So there's a lot of questions to be asked over, will this new system be any better? Will it actually have effective punishments? Will they, what other ways will there be to get around the new rules? Because of course, if it's based on 70% of your revenues, then are there things that you can do to increase your revenues in order to allow you to increase your spending? And the answer to that is obviously clearly yes. You can do more sponsorship deals, and are they going to be policed, and how effectively? So new system, wait and see, I would say, without any confidence that it would be particularly effective. The other thing is Alexander Seferin, the UEFA president, had talked over the last few years, while people were mulling over what a new system might look like, about an actual salary cap. He's very much talking about a hard cap. I know there are legal issues in Europe around capping salaries, but there are all sorts of sports around the world that have effective salary caps when there's buy-in from all the teams. But he obviously decided there was no prospect of getting that buy-in, so that has been ditched in favour of this 70% of your revenues.
Quite, and obviously cynics will argue that for certain clubs who perhaps are a bit more cavalier when it comes to adhering to the rules, may just simply wish to make a revenue figure read exactly what it needs to read in order to make the 70% rule work for them in their particular instance. And I guess that that is where the subject you mentioned a moment ago around policing of these rules is absolutely key, because again, critics will argue that UEFA did struggle to effectively police their own set of rules when it came to certain clubs. Clearly, they were quite effective at enforcing these rules when it came to clubs that don't wield much power, either on the world footballing stage or even wider and more broadly when it comes to the political sphere. But this is something that I guess is at the crux of ensuring that these new rules will work. If UEFA are seen to be weak or ineffective at policing them when it comes to the biggest clubs, and especially those clubs such as your PSG, your Manchester Cities, and now Newcastle United over the coming years, then again, cynics will argue that the rules are not really enforcing at that very highest echelons of football the kind of matters that they're trying to protect. And I guess that is where some fans will struggle with these set of rules and feel that, if anything, the change makes it more difficult for clubs that try to adhere to rules, whilst making it arguably easier for those that try to get around the rules.
Yeah, and that is going to come down to the policing and how effective that is. I think I think most of the even most of the big clubs, as things stand, will struggle to get their wages plus their amortization as things stand under the 70%. So it's closer to 85-90% for the big English clubs at the moment for those things, and higher still for some of them. And I guess we just have to wait and see what the clubs do in response. I mean, we don't know at this point, for example, what's going to happen at Newcastle in terms of spending. Now, PIF are in charge. They spent a bit of money in January, but it wasn't bonkers money. Are they going to attempt to go out in the summer and start spending hundreds of millions of pounds a year on players? And how are they going to do that to fit within both the new UEFA rules and the domestic FFP, which allows losses of 105 million, I think, over a 3-year period? Are they simply going to sign up a bunch of Saudi-based sponsors, giving them huge amounts of money in supposedly arm's length deals that will quite clearly be anything but? We don't know. So that's one to watch. And obviously, PSG and other situations that we can all think about. We've had big sponsorship deals that are from parties that are connected to ownership groups that are massively more than, say, a genuinely independent third party would probably pay. And obviously we never see the underbidders to some of these big contracts.
Right.
So yeah, I just think with UEFA, the headline is, this is the new rule. I think it's the 7th of April. It will be ratified and formally announced with a bit more detail. Tarek, very good story, good scoop. Tarek's got excellent contacts, and obviously we could take the story at face value. And I know from speaking to Tarek, I think we're both slightly sceptical over the extent to which it will be policed. And it certainly doesn't do anything to close the gap between the super clubs and the rest. And this is going to be at a time when the revamped Champions League, is going to be playing more games, and the bigger, richer clubs whose revenues just are bigger are going to have more firepower in terms of buying players and paying wages because their revenues just simply are bigger. So the more that you spend and the more that you can maintain your success at the top, the more revenue you will earn because you'll be playing regularly in European football and making greater European revenues because UEFA's broadcasting contracts are going up, and you'll be doing well domestically and getting money from that. And therefore if you're doing well domestically and in the Champions League, you'll be more global, as they are, the super clubs, and therefore you'll be attracting more sponsors. And you'll just go into this sort of cycle of increasing disparity between the super clubs and the rest. So to that extent, the new rules, I don't think, are going to do, and certainly not going to make the difference, the wealth gap, any better. FFP having a fixed amount of losses per year over and above what you earn is a better system for trying to sort of maintain some kind of closeness than I think the new system will be. But as I say, it remains to be seen.
Absolutely. So just sticking with the subject, but diverting our attention to the Premier League. So it has been just the 3 years since they launched their own investigation into Manchester City and their finances. And as far as I'm aware, it's still not been concluded. So do you think that there's any ambition at all within the Premier League, given this investigation that is dragged out for a far too prolonged a period, on top of the UEFA changing its rules, to result in the Premier League potentially devising its own set of rules that could potentially sit alongside the new rules in much the same way that the EFL has had in place for a number of years? Or do you think the Premier League might not really have the appetite to come up with something that perhaps sits over and above what the new set of rules could be?
Well, obviously the UEFA rules are for clubs playing in UEFA competition. And
Yes.
the Premier League rules are rules in place for all Premier League clubs, and they're obviously different in terms of the amounts and structuring, and they obviously remain in place. The issue with the Manchester City investigation, which began in March 2019, so we are 3 years on. It's this week actually due to enter its 4th year, and it was only we knew about it when it was announced because of an announcement, and then they said we won't be referring to it again until it's concluded. And it was only last year that we sort of went and realised that this thing is now being fought out in the courts, Manchester City versus the Premier League, and eventually, after we got what was in effect an injunction lifted, and we were allowed into court to hear some of the see some of what was going on, not a great deal, but at least to see that the parties were still at it legally. We realised quite how long and quite how secret the Premier League had been keeping it. We still don't know what the specific allegations are, apart from that they're around alleged financial fair play discrepancies, almost certainly in relation to the Der Spiegel allegations against Manchester City. And we wrote about it last year, and in effect, I think the fact that the Premier League was still spending money and still trying to get somewhere with it shows that there was an appetite in the hierarchy of the Premier League, probably being mightily encouraged by the other main rivals of Manchester City, not least Liverpool, Manchester United, Chelsea, Arsenal, Tottenham. I'm sure they would be encouraging the Premier League to keep on at, trying to get the evidence and potentially prosecute Manchester City if indeed Manchester City have broken the rules. But it all got, it's bogged. Manchester City have done what they did in effect with UEFA. They appear to be non-cooperating and doing everything they can to slow the process down as far as possible. So we don't even know at this stage whether or to what extent Manchester City have granted the Premier League's request to access for information, in other words, sort of discovery materials. And God knows how many years this kind of disclosure of information. These cases can drag on for years, just bogged down in technical arguments over disclosure. Manchester City can rightfully say, well, we're simply not just going to give you every single piece of information we've ever had in relation to any of our sponsorship deals, because that's just you on a fishing expedition. You have to come to us and tell us what you think we've got, and then we'll have a legal argument over whether we give it to you. And logic would suggest if there is anything that would get the Manchester City into trouble with the Premier League, they're certainly not going to hand it over voluntarily. So I think that problem is just intractable. As far as we know, it hasn't been concluded because the Premier League said they would announce as and when it concluded. My hunch last year was that it'll drag on and on and on and possibly end with some sort of agreement as the UEFA case ended, which was a fine for non-cooperation. And because you can't really, it would be a huge deal for the Premier League at this point to go and sanction Manchester City with any kind of sporting penalty, I think, even if they were found to have infringed the rules. So is it best for everyone just to sort of, if City, accepted a rap on the knuckles and a fine, is that good enough for the rivals? Are Man City, in fact, completely innocent of all allegations made against them? We don't know. But I'm not sure, the Premier League is still waging that battle without probably having an appetite to get into more fights. But again, the Premier League is a stakeholder group of 20 parties in any one season. And when, the not inconsiderably powerful voices of Manchester United and Liverpool and Arsenal and Chelsea are involved, they will clearly want to sort of hope that the Premier League see this thing through. But it's shrouded in secrecy, so we're not really any the wiser about what stage it's at.
No, absolutely. Right. So sticking with Manchester City just for one more topic. They recently finished atop the Deloitte Football Money League, which was published over the last week, and they finished atop for the first time, which meant that their revenues exceeded those of any football club on the planet for the 2020-21 season.
Yeah.
Key to that was their commercial revenues, which exceeded 270 million.
Yeah.
And in 2021, which was a season that saw a number of top clubs' commercial revenues suffer a hit. They reached that level, which was on par with Manchester United's probably top year when it comes to commercial revenue. So that is the level of commercial revenues Manchester City have hit, despite the fact that, one of the things we often hear sponsors look at is things like fan engagement and popularity of these clubs. And by many metrics, Manchester City are not on a par with the most popular clubs in the world. Despite that, though, their commercial revenues have hit very, very significant levels. It really is quite remarkable, isn't it, Nick? And during this season, of course, the club have announced yet more sponsorship deals with companies largely based in or having close links to Abu Dhabi. It is either pure coincidence or just the work of some absolutely genius people in the commercial department, or both.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the top 10 in the 1920 season, I don't think, you'd be particularly surprised. And these lists tend to sort of, people bob up and down one or two places in these lists typically. So Real Madrid might vie with Barcelona for supremacy. Years ago, until, I don't know, 10 or 11 years ago, Manchester United were always the one, and Barcelona and Real Madrid were vying for two, and a bit further back, maybe Milan were up there, and Bayern Munich would always be in the top 5 and sometimes 4 or sometimes 3. So the top 10 in 2019-20 were number 1 Barcelona, Real Madrid in 2nd, Bayern Munich in 3rd, Manchester United in 4th, and Liverpool in 5th. All of those clubs with European pedigrees, multiple Champions League / European Cups, God knows how many between them, 20, probably more, maybe 20 more than 20 Champions League, European Cups between those 5 clubs. And then City was 6th, Paris Saint-Germain 7th, Chelsea 8th, Tottenham 9th, and Juventus 10th. Now the same 10 teams comprise the top 10 of the latest rich list released early 2022. Just released for the 2021 season. Tottenham and Juve have swapped places. Instead of Tottenham being 9th, they're down to 10th, and Juve are up a place. Chelsea stay the same in 8th. Paris Saint-Germain are down, one place. Liverpool are down 2 places. And the biggest riser, as you say, in this pandemic year is Manchester City, have leapfrogged from 6th in that list with revenues of 549 million euro straight to number 1 with a revenue increase of 100 million euros in a year in which most other clubs had flat or declining revenues because of the pandemic. Now, when you break down Manchester City's revenue, their match day revenue was tiny. I think it was, 15 or something million, because it was less
in 1920.
Sorry,
in 2021.
Well, it was 1 million for match day.
Yes.
So in terms of, and in pounds, the revenue, so if we do it in pounds, it had gone up from 2020 revenue was 481 million, and then it had gone up by 90 million pounds to 571 million. Oh. So it jumped 90 million pounds at a time when everyone else's revenues are flat or declining, pretty much. Now, they didn't have virtually any match day revenue in 2021, under £1 million. Their TV revenue had soared up to close to 300 million, 297, and that's because some of the revenue that they had not had in the Project Restart season that then basically fell into the next financial year. So revenues that they hadn't had with a lot of clubs, this was the same. But as you say, the big thing is this rise in commercial revenue to £272.9 million. Again, at a time in a pandemic when everyone's struggling. And yes, you're right to point to, the main new sponsors. They do have sponsors, some big household name sponsors, of course, not related to Abu Dhabi, but their key sponsorship deals, their headline, the Etihad deal, which we don't actually know the current value of. It's not something they declare. It was 67.5 million, 5, 6, 7 years ago. So don't know what that is now. I mean, and that's at a time, obviously that's the campus sponsorship and the shirt sponsorship. But yeah, there are other, deals related to companies based in Abu Dhabi. I think more than half of that commercial revenue, I worked it out. I think last time I looked at it, it was about 56% of their commercial revenues were from companies, based in Abu Dhabi. Which again is fine if you have your connections and you have your businesses, but who want to sponsor the club because that's where the owner comes from, then that's fair enough. But obviously, City failed FFP in 2014 because they were found to have overinflated certain revenue streams, and the second case, which got the ban overturned again, was related to disguised and inflated income. So yeah, it is, given that City, just on any normal sort of footballing metric, when you're looking at sort of TV audiences, social media followings, European Cup wins, the real pinnacle, the European royalty, Real Madrid and Barcelona and Bayern Munich, obviously the big Italian clubs, and the big English clubs, they're not in that bracket yet. I think they're clearly knocking on the door. 5 Premier Leagues out of the last 10, 3 out of the last 4. Possibly, if they win it this season, if they win it this season, it will be 4 out of the last 5, depending on what Liverpool do to prevent that. But it's not a secret that Sheikh Mansour and Khaldoon want the European Cup. They want the Champions League, because until they actually win that trophy, then they've never been European champions, and that's the big thing. So in that regard, they're just not in that top echelon bracket, and yet that their revenues have been so consistently high, despite not being on the same level, is obviously interesting.
That's one way to put it. Yeah, sure. It's certainly something that has many observers scratching their heads in terms of how they quite achieve it. But
that's not to say, however, the money has come in, and it'd be great. It'd be great to have a breakdown or at some point and meet some of the chief executives of the companies who sort of pouring this money in, and to go behind the curtain and see how the deals are done, and talk to executives and get people to explain to you, in business terms, how is this? What's the return on investment here? What do the activations look like for these sponsorship deals? And we've asked a number of times to sort of say, look, can we talk to people? Can we go through some numbers and talk us through it in a business sense? Because in a purely business sense, I never really saw how even a £67 million deal for Etihad worked in an ROI terms, or how that was sort of comparable to the sort of values that Manchester United and other big clubs were getting for their shirts. That City should have been getting 67 for a campus and shirt deal at a point when Manchester United's Chevy deal was worth quite a lot less.
Yeah.
It seems a bit, it seems very, very, very good work by City's commercial team, playing a blinder.
Absolutely playing a blinder, in many ways. But right, so just moving on. Just give me 1 second. So, moving on to another club then, whose ownership has created much debate over the years, in Chelsea.
Yeah.
They're about to go through a big change with Roman Abramovich's time clearly up, having had Chelsea essentially seized by the government and its sale being overseen by the Rain Group, with proceeds from sales reportedly set to be diverted to Ukraine by the government. If we can start with Abramovich to begin with when it comes to this story, though his time as owner has been discussed at great length over recent weeks, what do you make of his legacy? Overall, do you think it will be looked at favourably or unfavourably in respect to the influence he has had on English football?
Right. Well, it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, from a Chelsea fan perspective, his legacy will be brilliant, transformative. He's overseen the best years of Chelsea's history in terms of trophies. I think it's 5 Premier Leagues, 2 Champions League, FA Cups, League Cups, I think, as well, Europa League. I think, so trophy strewn, some of the biggest and best players, some great managers. So from a Chelsea fan perspective, the legacy is untarnished. Chelsea fans almost, universally adore him and are thankful for him. And they also point to, community work. The Chelsea Trust, the Chelsea community sort of work. It has done lots of good, positive stuff for the local community. Abramovich he was one of the early people who handed over Chelsea Hotel and the facilities in the COVID pandemic. I know Chelsea fans who've met Abramovich, and he is personally engaged in lots of sort of anti-racism and anti-Semitism stuff. So from that point of view, his legacy will be untarnished amongst Chelsea fans. In terms of his footballing legacy, I think it is unarguable, regardless of what you think of his money and how he got it. And obviously people think that it's ill-gotten gains. And of course, in the past, he didn't serve time in prison, but he was handed a prison sentence for his activities in the past. Taking state assets to turn yourself into an oligarch billionaire is not necessarily that classy. But so if you set aside all that stuff, then from a footballing point of view, we were, before he arrived in the summer of 2003, the Premier League was basically a duopoly. It was Manchester United and it was Arsenal. And he came in as the disruptor who, brought in Jose Mourinho, who at that point was box office and not just a boring old joke. So his money allowed that to happen, and lots of people, even more widely than Chelsea, were excited about the fact that Manchester United had a challenger and that Arsenal had a challenger. So from a football point of view, it is complex, because you sort of, in the same way that Manchester City, Mansour comes along and shakes it up with his money as well. And again, question marks over the way that they did it, but it clearly increased the competition beyond Liverpool and Arsenal. And Arsenal have then been in the doldrums without a title for, was it 4-5 was there, or was it 3-4?
3-4.
3-4 was Invincible season. That was their last title. So you're looking at 18 years since Arsenal won the title. Isn't that amazing?
That's correct. Yeah.
18
closing
years.
in on 2 decades.
So obviously Chelsea have won titles in relatively recent times. Manchester United obviously haven't since 2013. So from that point of view, you could argue, as obviously Chelsea fans and Man City fans do, that it increases the competition. But in terms of the wider legacy of him, throwing into sharp focus again how he came, we all know how he came about the money. We all knew from the beginning, and people have talked about it for a long time. I was, writing about the darker side of Abramovich years ago, and some other people were as well. But how many times can you bang the same drum? But obviously, when you have a war in Europe being perpetrated by Vladimir Putin, who's obviously a gangster and a megalomaniac and possibly also going mad, and it's thrown into sharp focus just quite how closely connected, according to government intelligence and now the British government, Abramovich is to Putin in terms of how he has benefited from Putin's patronage. Then at a time of war, and with the threat of nuclear war hanging over us, then obviously we now look at it suddenly, just in the last, the war's been raging a month, 5 weeks, people suddenly, you're smacking your forehead and saying, oh my God, of course, this guy who's worth 11 or 13 billion pounds or whatever is actually worth that, because he's just really, really well politically connected in the Kremlin. And his support for Putin and vice versa have, kept Putin in power, and vice versa kept the oligarchs happy and free to amass this money and keep it. And therefore, the legacy in those terms is obviously absolutely damning, that it's taken a war that's killing thousands of people, including hundreds of civilians and children, and shocking footage that we're all watching on a daily basis. You're just, well, of course, this is absolutely obscene. Why weren't we, asking more questions, and why weren't we considering this stuff long before now? So from that point of view, his legacy is just, it's a blot.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, I mean, yourself and other writers like Matthew Said have written at length about.
Matthew's been banging on about Abramovich for years. to his credit, and he I know Matthew's a Marmite journalist. You know, I like Matthew, and I like a lot of his stuff, and we disagree profoundly about other parts of it. But he has, to be fair to him, been banging on about Abramovich for a long time.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and you know, he will certainly be feeling vindicated about, you know, a lot of the stuff he had written and talked about, commented about Abramovich, and you know, and about the subject more broadly about, you know, oligarchs in London, and the kind of spread of influence over quite a prolonged period, and how that was encouraged by the establishment to some extent. But that's another subject for another podcast. Sticking to football then. So we know now that there is a short list of 4 bidders, and some are speculating that, perhaps surprisingly, the club could be sold for in excess of $3 billion. From what we know about the 4 bidders, none of the 4 are likely to bankroll the club in the way that Abramovich did over the last nearly 2 decades, and that ultimately will be difficult for many Chelsea fans to come to terms with, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many more questions than answers about this whole issue, not least this price. I mean, $3 billion is what? It's more than £2 billion. Now, from a purely financial point of view, what is Chelsea worth? What is Chelsea actually worth if you sort of are trying to give it a valuation of, even if you were buying it with cash and you weren't taking out loans, you didn't have, you know, high interest loans or whatever, if you could fund it with cash, what's it actually worth? Now, if you're really, really, really mega wealthy, someone who's got 20 or 30 billion, and you can just say 2 billion is fine, it's an asset that I want, I'm not necessarily interested in return on investment, then fine. But if any of these people, any of the people who are in the running, are going to pay £2 billion and then have to get over the problem, not just of how to redevelop Stamford Bridge or move away, but fund that to the tune of another billion plus to sort out the long-standing Chelsea Stadium issue, then you know, you're only going to add another 20,000 seats, and yes, your revenues might be quite a lot higher, but if it's cost you £1 billion, you're not going to see a return on investment of that £1 billion that you've spent on the stadium, let alone in terms of the club. I mean, there's one, the model that I prefer in terms of valuations of clubs is one known as the Markham multivariate model. Tom Markham, who is an accountant who's worked for, you know, as a doing due diligence for people, for club buyers and owners, and has worked as a, you know, checking club finances for various agencies and bodies. Smart guy. So he, you know, finalised the models, and the Markham multivariate model in 2013. Actually, first wrote about it in detail on sportingintelligence.com, and anyone could go to the website, search for Markham, and find those pieces, and in fact find a copy of the original model and the formula. Now, Tom's model would put Chelsea objectively worth about 1.3, maybe 1.5 billion pounds, but above that, no. I mean, it just doesn't work. A valuation of above that, in terms of what the club has got, in terms of its assets, its revenues, its profits and losses, its trading figures, it just doesn't. It doesn't make sense. So you could just assume that maybe, you know, these 4 groups have got more money than we think, have got loan facilities potentially that are not going to be costly. I mean, I know that the Ricketts family, who are backed by a hedge fund billionaire who's got, you know, allegedly worth sort of 20 billion pounds or dollars, Ken Griffin. I mean, if Ken Griffin has got cash that he can inject, and they just fancy this big prize Premier League asset, and the gamble is not necessarily that it provides return on investment necessarily, but that as a long-term asset to hold in 10 or 20 years, its core asset value will dramatically increase. I guess if that's the play, then fair enough. But the idea that Chelsea is, you know, I think the fact that we're talking about it being worth £2 billion is only because now there seem to be these 4 bids, but in themselves, you know, they're problematic. You've got the Team Bowley bid led by the US billionaire Ted Bowley, who's a part owner of LA Dodgers and also an NBA basketball team. and partners, and the bid from the Ricketts family, who've got the hedge fund guy with them, they would appear to me to be the least encumbered by other issues, because the other two bids, there's the bid led by Sir Martin Broughton, the former chairman of British Airways, which has got the US tycoons David Blitzer and Josh Harris as part of the financial muscle. Now, they both own 18% each of Crystal Palace. Now, they would have to divest themselves of that interest, or at least take it down under 10% if they were going to, depending what stake they were going to take in Chelsea. And they'd have to do that, apparently, by the end of April. That's a problem. And then the fourth bid is a guy called Stephen Pagliuca, who's co-owner of the Boston Celtics basketball team in the NBA and 55% shareholder of Atalanta in Serie A.
Yeah.
Again, he's going to have to massively downsize his Atalanta stake if he's going to buy Chelsea. Again, below 10% to fit with UEFA rules, I think it is. So those bids have got that problem. And then there is this issue of, okay, so if you are going to pay more than $1.5 billion just to buy the thing, how are you going to fund that? Are you funding that with cash? Are you funding that with debt? If you're funding it with debt, what at this point of rising interest rates are your interest rates going to be? And what are your plans for the stadium? Because I think Rain in New York are very much encouraging all the groups to come forward with costed and detailed proposals about this what has been a long-term problematic issue of a stadium. Stamford Bridge is, a 40,000 seat ground in a capital where its capital rivals alone are West Ham with 60,000 seats, Arsenal with 60,000 seats, Tottenham with 60,000 or whatever theirs is. You've got, the other big clubs expanding elsewhere in the northwest. So, do they stay at Stamford Bridge and do a really £1 billion?
And the costs of construction are going up exponentially, of course, as well. So,
I mean, planning permission that Abramovich had actually expired in April 2021 as well. So they'd actually have to, not that there would necessarily be a problem with planning permission, but they would have to go through the whole planning process again, because the Abramovich planning permission's expired. So yeah, the cost of steel, the cost of fuel, interesting to watch, but no doubt there are some rich people involved, but two of them I think appear to be problematic because of the ownership issues, and they're not really, I wouldn't have thought, the kind of issues that can be sorted that quickly. Can Harris and Blitzer sell up in a month or downsize in a month?
And that is a large part of the problem. I mean, I'm an accountant myself. I'm involved in an acquisition for significantly less sums of money, and that is something that, in terms of due diligence and all the rest of it is something that is and will be taking quite a number of months. The Rain Group is looking to wrap up this sale in a matter of weeks. This is for a multi-billion pound or dollar sum. So I really think it doesn't really stack up in terms of getting the deal done, but with the the bidders obviously needing to commit full due diligence. I mean, it'd be absolutely foolish to make a purchase of this size without carrying out the full due diligence, especially when it comes to the fact that they know, all four of them, that what they have to say, pledge when it comes to the stadium, whether it's expanding Stamford Bridge or moving the club elsewhere, in itself is going to be complex. And all of this will take time.
I mean, the other thing in favour of the Bowley and the Ricketts bids is they've both bid for Chelsea before. I can't remember which order it was, but one bid in 2018 and one bid in 2019. So they will have done a large degree of the due diligence and be familiar with the books. They will have, certainly the Ricketts, I know, have been in touch with the stadium, the Abramovich's, new stadium planning team, the architect. They have been through all that, and the Bowley people will have been through that when they bid. So they'll be ahead in that regard as well. But back to your original question about the whole thing of Chelsea, and Chelsea will be living in a new reality under the new owners, is that, remember, these guys operating in US sport, in baseball, basketball, respectively, well, baseball and basketball in Bowley's case, baseball in the Ricketts case, is these are leagues that are closed shops where there are wage structures built around fixed percentages of team revenues and sort of league revenues. So they're guaranteed to. Generally they're guaranteed profits. They're sort of profitable organisations because the bargaining agreements on wages, give a degree of cost controls. And in baseball, there's obviously a luxury tax. So, if you don't spend loads and loads, or if you spend within the wage limits and you're not paying luxury tax, then you're generally fine. And if you're, the biggest spending teams, the luxury tax gets levied and then gets shared. So there's a lot of degree of protection from the huge TV deals that these sports have in America, and it's a very different model. It's closed shop, and to a degree it's safeguarded, and it's obviously very, very different here. So the bottom line of Abramovich's 19 years is 1.5 billion that he is owed, that he says he's not going to take, but from Fordstam, the parent company. He has put in 1.5 billion over and above what the club have cost to run. And if these guys from America are coming in thinking that they are going to run their businesses in the way they run their American businesses, which is, breaking even or for profit, then de facto Chelsea are going to be having to operate on lower budgets in the future than they have to this point, which has cost £1.5 billion of Abramovich loans. So that might mean cutting their wage bill, and it might mean spending less on players, because if they're going to run the businesses to make money or break even, there isn't really an alternative than either dramatically increasing your revenues, either your commercial revenues, if they think they can monetize that, particularly in America. I guess that is an option, but it's going to be a different reality for Chelsea fans. And we could see what's happened at Arsenal over, obviously since the double season. They're building a new stadium, they're building the stadium, and how they cut back on the playing side, and their wage bill has dropped well behind certainly Manchester City, Liverpool, Chelsea, and that's shown on the pitch. And although they do, now seem to be getting their act together, Champions League, probably favourites for Champions League, 4th spot now. They're living under a new reality because Kroenke hasn't been piling loads of money in. And obviously we know what happened with the Glazers. They have actually put in a lot of money in terms of wage bills and players. I think it's of the 17 most expensive players of all time in world football. Manchester United have signed 4 of them, including Pogba, who was a world record when he signed. Harry Maguire, who remarkably remains the most expensive defender in the history of football. And then Romelu Lukaku and Jadon Sancho are all inside the top 17 most expensive players. And obviously they've always had a pretty high wage bill, but then they've also taken out a lot of money. They leveraged the club in the first place. They take out dividends, and they've taken out, billions, not billions multiple, but certainly more than $1 billion in loans and fees and repayments and whatever. So, whereas Liverpool's owners, have got their, obviously signing a Klopp was a masterstroke, and that has worked out brilliantly. And seem to be doing things certainly in a slightly different way than Kroenke and the Glazers.
Absolutely, and I think what's common amongst the current set of American owners in the Premier League is that even though their business models do differ from one to the next, one thing they all have in common is the fact that they look to fund that the clubs spend, whether it's on player acquisitions, whether it's on investment in infrastructure, through funds that the club are generating. And though, yes, FSG, the Liverpool owners, did take out a loan to fund the expansion of the main stand, which was completed 5-6 years ago now, it is nonetheless money that they didn't inject directly from their own funds. And in the same way, the Glazers have not done that during their 17 years of ownership of Manchester United. Neither have the Kroenkes at Arsenal. And I suspect that all 4 of these bidders, at the point at which one of them are to be appointed as the new owners of Chelsea, will likely adopt a model closer in line to that of perhaps an FSG and the Liverpool model, which is ultimately about financial self-sustainability and about funding the club's activities from monies generated by the club itself rather than injecting funds themselves. And I suspect that the higher this winning bid has to reach, on top of whatever funds are required for investment into either Stamford Bridge or a new stadium, ultimately will mean even less money to potentially spend when it comes to player recruitment. And ultimately, many, if not most, football fans are fickle and ultimately do judge ownership groups by the investment that they put into player acquisitions. And I think that is something that I think some Chelsea fans will certainly struggle with, at least initially, when it comes to a change of ownership. But on that subject, Nick, just earlier today, as we record this, the Mail on Sunday published a story about a survey that you had conducted and something you'd worked on over the last several months. And you sought fan views about the owners of the 20 Premier League clubs. So firstly, why did you decide to undertake this exercise? And were you pleased with the response?
So we decided to undertake it because obviously there's talk. Well, not talk. I mean, the Tracy Crouch report, fan-led independent review of governance in football, and whether, ultimately concluded that recommended there should be an independent regulator. I mean, I've been doing my job, football business, football finance, and football politics for 26 years, national newspapers, and people have been talking about regulators and regulation for that whole time. Successive governments have vowed in manifestos this, that, and the other, and nothing's ever happened. And, just some of the fiascos of the last few years. Project Big Picture was just ridiculous. Obviously, that involved Liverpool's owner fairly prominently, along with Joel Glazer. And then the Super League, which was rightly and roundly and very quickly derided and killed off, was, these kind of things are respectively the death of English football and arguably the death of, competitive European football, had Project Picture and ESL come off as originally envisaged. And so, these are sort of clear dangers to the very fabric of football. You're moving towards, well, in the case of ESL, closed leagues. Your Project Picture, you were moving to the power switching forever to 7 clubs, and you only know that's going one way when you've got the biggest, most powerful clubs wanting all the control and all the money. So these things, as well as the fact that there's been a pandemic and all the issues that's thrown up about football, and so it was, I guess, it was in that whole space of me thinking that, actually, there's quite a lot right with football still, fundamentally, with this, certainly the game, if not the industry, and people still love it and it's very important. But at the same time, my view has always been, if you get good owners in charge of football clubs, and by good owners, I don't mean rich owners or people who are willing to chuck loads of money at football, because chucking loads of money at football is never a guarantee of success, as you can see at Manchester United since 2013, as you can see at Derby under Mel Morris, who's a genuine Derby fan who's lost £250 million of his money by making bad decisions, but he's a fan and he did it in the hope that it would do good things for his club. But my view is, if you have good owners, so that means people who are not just going to chuck money, but who could be sensible and do things carefully, then I think fundamentally you will have a better game and a better, fairer game overall. So that was my starting point, to kind of try and set up, well, first go and speak to the fans through a survey of, certainly starting as we did with the 20 Premier League clubs, and ask the simple questions that would come up with usable sort of binary data. So a question about, on balance, do you think your owners during their reign, whatever it is, so at Liverpool it was, do you think Fenway have been good owners on balance since 2010? at Brentford, it was, do you think Matt Benham has been a good owner of Brentford since 2009? And so on. Chelsea fans were asked, blood, do you think Abramovich since 2000? A yes or no, a binary thing. So people, it's very clear, it provides clear data. And then another question was, who else do you find to be an admirable owner outside of your club? One of the other 19 clubs, who do you think is an admirable owner? And then there was a question about a regulator. Do you know this issue, particularly over the PIF Saudi bid, which has thrown up the whole ownership debate into sharper focus since that has gone through, and the debate around sovereign wealth funds and nation states and government-backed individuals. So I asked the question: do you want a regulator, and do you want that regulator to have the power to sort of say no more nation states or no nation states? Are nation states owning football clubs good for our game? Are sovereign wealth funds good for our game? What will it actually lead to? And I think obviously the survey was envisaged and started and conducted sort of January, February. The geopolitical events of recent weeks have actually made this more relevant than ever. But the reason for starting it, the premise for starting it, is my hypothesis that good owners are in all kinds of, measured by different metrics, are good for football. And actually, there's probably more good owners than we necessarily think, because we might think of bad owners or people who bankrupt clubs or people who spend loads of money and waste it and then get into trouble and leave. But so I wanted to ask fans about their perceptions of their club and their owners, and also their perceptions of other club and other owners, and then also this issue about a regulator. What do you, as a fan of football clubs, want to see from a regulator? So that was why what we set out to do. And then a separate piece from that, I did a really pretty vast piece of data dive into how much each of the owners in their current reigns had spent on transfers on average annually through their years, and on wages, and what had that produced in terms of trophies, so adding up the trophies. Another quite simple but quite telling thing was, what is the average league position of the club during the ownership, and what was it in the 5 years before they took over? Because that alone, that really simple metric alone, is pretty telling. Generally speaking, if the league position during any given owner's reign is higher than it was in the 5 years before they've taken over, pretty much you could say, well, it looks like they've been a good owner. And just in other ways, I mean, in actual fact, in the case of Liverpool, their average league position in the 5 years before Fenway took over was 3.8 in the Premier League, and in the completed season since, it's 4.6. But obviously, Liverpool in the last 4 or 5 years are going to, if they finish first or second this season, that 4.6 will be down to probably below what the previous thing, and so they'll tick that box. So looking at all these metrics, and then all the, so in the case of Delia Smith, I went back 26 years through Norwich's finances for 26 years, looking at the amortization, the net transfer spend amortization, the wages, adjusted all the figures for inflation, so you could work out, for example, on a like-for-like basis. So to give you an example, Man City's average net spend in the 14 years since Mansour took over on player transfers is £116 million. That's adjusted to 2022 prices per year. And the average wages per year is £269 million. So if I give you a comparison with Liverpool's net spend per year under Fenway has been 49.8, so under half of what Man City have spent, and the wage bill 245.7, which is 20 million behind. But if you go to Brentford, for example, in the 13 years Matt Benham's been in charge, his average net spend per year of his 13 years in charge is minus 5.8 million. In other words, he's made a profit of an average profit of nearly £6 million every year he's been in charge in terms of transfers. And his average wage bill, and obviously they've been down in the lower leagues, not just Championship, but below that, his average wage spend has been 21.4 million a year in his 13 years. So when you're looking at the comparison at one end, Manchester City's wages and net spend per year, £385 million per year, adjusted to 2022 figures during Mansour's reign. At Brentford, that's 15.6 million. And obviously the different clubs. So that was the rationale for doing it, to find out what people thought about owners. And then the results obviously, were presented today. a huge majority of fans across most clubs are in favour of a regulator who would like to see nation states and people backed by governments and sovereign wealth funds. 85% of all fans, two clubs. If two clubs hadn't voted so much against that, and those two clubs were Man City and Newcastle for fairly obvious reasons, then it would have been obviously well above 90%. So that was one finding, and then there was all the deep dive detail into what the individual fans thought of their owners, and I think, you know, I thought it was interesting because we carried all the financial stuff, and obviously people filling in the forms could tell us why they thought different people, you know, were good, why their owners were good, and why they liked other clubs, and so there was just mountains, you know, 11,000 sets of responses, some of them thousands of, you know, I think some of the individual forms ended up running into more than 1,000 words each. When you were when you know, some people responding about what they wanted a regulator to do, given an open box to fill in, we're using 500-600 words to say this, and this. In the same way that people, when talking about why they thought their owners were good or bad, were using hundreds of words. So, you know, you had nearly 11,000 responses to go through, and some of them were 1,000 words each, and quite a lot of them were 2 or 3 sentences, like 20 words each. So that was more common, a couple of paragraphs, but that's still 11,000 data, you know, responses to go through to then sort of analyze and to produce quotes that are sort of consensus quotes on what different fan groups felt about their owners and also about the regulator.
And I love the detractors consensus quote on Manchester City. I thought that was very well written.
Yeah, that was okay. So the detractor quote there was, so again, the fan. I'll just run through Man City. Sheikh Mansour, been in charge since 2008. Average league position in the 5 years before he took over, it's 12th. Average league position in completed seasons under his ownership, 2.77. So that's a massive plus. Average net spend on players adjusted to 2022 prices, 115.6 million. Average wage bill, 269.5 million. Regulatory issues, obviously the sanctioned by FFP twice, ongoing PL investigation. Achievements, 5 Premier League titles, 2 FA Cups, 6 League Cups, pretty impressive. More than 90%, not surprisingly. Approval rating, fan comments summarising the consensus view, i.e. the approval, long-term strategy, clear goals, excellent in everything from Julius to women to brilliant first team, regeneration of East Manchester, all of course, all true, all obvious. And the detractor view, so in each case, the detractor view would be, you know, one of the rare people who wasn't necessarily a fan of the owner. What was their summary? And that was, most realise we haven't obeyed FFP, that's why everyone hates us. Like to have done it without the cheating, so we had respect, but trophies, exclamation mark. Which again is the, you only need to go on social media to see that is the view. And if that's the view of Man City fans, then fair enough. They've enjoyed a period of quality football and silverware since Mansour came in that is, you know, unheard of in English football in recent decades. Pep Guardiola is a brilliant manager, no doubt about it. He's done it produced record-winning teams at Barcelona and Bayern Munich, and obviously at Manchester City in the play. Amazing football, and they've had, you know, amazingly talented players there. I mean, you know, I know Company was there long before Pep, but inspirational figure. David Silva, brilliant player. Obviously Kevin De Bruyne, brilliant player. Foden is bright, one of the brightest talents in English football has seen for arguably for generations. It's great. But yeah, the fan view is, you know, they kind of revel in the fact of calling themselves the oil team, and, you know, you hate us, we don't care, and that is the sort of, that is the view. That's, so be it.
Indeed. Right, well, we've covered a heck of a lot there in best part of an hour, Nick.
Yes, you can cut it in half now and just cut out all the waffle.
No, it was all gold, I can assure you. I mean, it was, as I say, at the back of a very noteworthy and newsworthy week. You know, we just talked about during this podcast, a lot of developments on all of these stories. over the last 7 or so days. And obviously with a couple of these stories, the Chelsea sale in particular, there will be obviously a lot more to come out over the coming days, weeks, possibly months as well. But I do want to really thank you for your time. I know you've been very busy with all sorts of stories, including obviously the one that was published today. And obviously there's so much going on at the moment. But your time in joining us today is something that not only I, but our listeners also appreciate. So just as we conclude and close this podcast, Nick, where can people find you on social media?
Just on Twitter at Sporting Intel, and there, if you go to the sportingintelligence.com website, we do have a Facebook page. We haven't, it's not a lot of stuff on the Facebook page, but there is a Facebook page, and obviously sportingintelligence.com, the website, which has, as I said, hasn't had a lot of content on it in recent years for personal reasons, but there's lots and lots of stuff there that still is relevant to sort of issues around football finance. Like you say, you can find Tom Markham's model there. You can go in and look at all sorts of previous analysis of transfer spending, of wages, of FFP issues, there's investigative stuff there on football and other issues. So there's a lot of stuff still on sportingintelligence.com that might be of interest to people.
Tremendous. And certainly listeners, I do urge you to follow Nick if you aren't doing so already, and also strongly encourage you to read the article on the fan survey,
which you can find all the links on my Twitter handle. So it's
absolutely
just at Sporting Intel, all one word.
Fantastic. Listeners, I'll be back in the coming weeks. I've produced an unprecedented amount of money talks during this past month. I think 5 in total. That's very unusual for me. I'm normally running it around a month, one a month. So dangerously steering away from being the resident part-timer here on Anfield Index. But I'll be getting back into old ways, and likely we'll only have one Money Talks out during the month of April before we return with the very popular transfer committee, I suspect, in May. So do keep an eye out for that. But until next time, thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community, where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at anfieldindex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index, and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.